I thought I had buried my husband 5 years ago. I stood at his grave, prayed for his soul, and learned how to breathe in a world that no longer had him in it. I mourned him every single night, believing death had taken him from me forever, until one ordinary morning, when a simple golf club bill from Cancun exposed a truth so cruel it shattered my reality. It showed me that Emilio was not dead at all. He was alive, living freely, and had even built a new life with my own daughter-in-law. The man I cried for and prayed over had not been taken by fate. He had erased me by choice. He faked his death and walked away from our marriage, our home, and everything we built together. I am glad you are here reading this. Stay until the end and tell me what city you are watching from, because I want to know how far this story of betrayal and divine justice travels. My name is Rosario Vega. I am 65 years old, and this is the story of how I discovered that the most devastating lies often hide inside the love we once believed was sacred. After the accident, my life became an echo of what it once was. The mornings were painfully silent, so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking, reminding me with every second that I was alone. Each night, I lit a candle in front of Emilio's portrait, the same photograph I had chosen for his funeral, the man with whom I shared 40 years of love, sacrifice, faith, and struggle. I spoke to his image as if he could still hear me, telling him how much I missed him and how empty the house felt without him. But the portrait only stared back with a frozen smile, as if time itself had died the day he supposedly did. 2 years later, I lost my son Daniel, and that loss nearly destroyed what was left of me. From then on, Casa Vega, our jewelry store, became both my refuge and my punishment. Every diamond I cleaned felt like a tear that refused to fall, every receipt a reminder that life kept moving even though mine felt frozen. Valerie, my daughter-in-law, stepped forward during that time and offered me her help. I welcomed her with open arms because she was the last living piece of Daniel I had left. I treated her like a daughter, trusted her completely, and gave her the keys to the store, access to the accounts, and control over decisions I was too exhausted to make. I never imagined that behind her gentle voice and comforting presence lived the face of my misfortune, nor that her kindness hid the shadow of a betrayal that would reach deep enough to steal my peace, my faith, and nearly my soul. That morning in Guadalajara was bright and warm, the air filled with the smell of the garden outside the shop as I opened the jewelry store early, just as I always did. I went straight to the counter to review the bank statements, a routine I had kept since Emilio's death because managing the finances was the only way I felt I still had control over something in my life. Around 10 o'clock, the bell above the door rang, and the mailman handed me a white envelope stamped with the bank's seal. I barely glanced at it at first, assuming it was just another routine notice, and opened it casually while organizing invoices on the glass counter. But the moment my eyes landed on the printed line, my body went cold. It read automatic payment Cancun Golf and Country Club annual fee 120,000 pesos. I stared at the paper again and again, trying to understand what I was seeing. That account belonged to Emilio. Only Emilio ever used it. I was certain I had closed it after his death, yet there it was, alive on paper while my husband lay supposedly buried in the ground. Without even locking the store, I rushed to the bank. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my purse, and when the cold air of the building hit my face, it did nothing to calm the fire burning inside my chest. I explained everything to the teller, forcing my voice to stay steady even as it cracked. He took my identification and typed silently into his computer while minutes stretched into an eternity, and when he finally looked up, there was hesitation in his eyes. He told me the account was active. I whispered that there must be a mistake because my husband had died 5 years earlier, but he lowered his voice and said Mr. Emilio Vega Rivera had come in person just 2 weeks ago to update his digital signature. The room spun, my knees weakened, and I had to grip the counter to keep from collapsing as the truth sank in. I asked him if he was absolutely sure, and he nodded, saying there was even a copy of the new signature on file. I asked for the receipt, and the teller hesitated as if he sensed that what I was about to see would change my life forever. When he finally handed it to me, my heart stopped. That signature was Emilio S. The curve of the letters, the hurried close of the R, the same strokes I had seen on love letters, business contracts, and even on the gravestone I had paid to engrave with his name. The noise of the bank faded away, and it felt as though a freezing wind had torn through my chest. For a moment I thought I must be imagining things, that grief had finally broken my mind, but ink does not lie. Those were his hands on that page, alive and deliberate. Something inside me shattered in that moment, but something else was born as well. I was no longer a woman who would survive on tears and prayers alone. I pressed the receipt against my chest, closed my eyes, and made a silent promise to myself. If Emilio was alive, then someone in my family would have to answer for this betrayal. That morning, as the sun slowly filtered through the dining room curtains, I knew I could no longer postpone what had to be done. Several days had passed since the discovery of the golf club bill, and during that time, the silence inside the house had grown unbearable, so dense it felt like it pressed against my chest. I could hear my own thoughts echoing through every room. I walked into the kitchen where Valeria sat calmly at the table, sipping her coffee while scrolling through her phone, as if life were nothing more than a series of pleasant distractions. I forced a smile that felt foreign on my face and told her I needed a few days away, that I wanted to go to the beach to rest, to pray for Daniel, and maybe find some peace from the grief that continued to gnaw at my heart. She looked up at me with that same perfect smile I had trusted for so long, the one that once felt warm but now appeared practiced and hollow. She told me, sweetly and without hesitation, that a change of scenery would do me good, completely unaware that with those words she was helping seal her own fate. I nodded, pretending calm, and walked back to my room before my composure betrayed me. Inside, I opened the old wooden wardrobe that still smelled of cedar and memories and began searching through the drawers until my fingers found our wedding photograph. The glass was cracked and the image faded with time, but Emilio's eyes were still there, staring back at me with the same promise I once believed in. Holding it in my hands, I felt the weight of 40 years, the weight of lies layered over love, the crushing realization that perhaps the marriage I mourned had never existed in the way I believed. My lips trembled as I whispered his name and made a vow so quiet only God could hear it. If you are alive, Emilio, he will be my witness. I placed the photograph carefully inside my bag, closed the wardrobe, and took a deep breath. Outside my room, Valeria was humming a careless tune. I grabbed my keys, adjusted my shawl, and paused at the hallway for one last look, knowing I was not leaving for a vacation but for the truth. The humid heat of Cancun wrapped around me the moment I stepped out of the airport. The air smelled of salt, flowers, and new beginnings, yet inside me there was only suspicion and dread. The sky was impossibly blue, tourists laughed freely around me, and still I walked through that paradise like a ghost who did not belong. I took a taxi without looking at the driver, clutching my bag where the wedding photograph rested like a fragile relic of a life stolen from me. When I arrived at the Cancun Golf and Country Club, the contrast was painful. Perfect lawns stretched endlessly, luxury cars gleamed in the sun, and expensive perfume lingered in the air. My simple shoes squeaked softly against a floor that was clearly not meant for someone like me. I approached the reception desk where a young woman in an immaculate uniform greeted me with a flawless smile and addressed me by my full name, welcoming me back as if I had never left. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, but she continued typing calmly and explained that my husband had renewed his membership 2 weeks earlier and mentioned that I might soon return to him. Each word struck my chest like a silent blow. I nodded, pretending understanding, while inside my heart collapsed piece by piece, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and the cruel beauty of a place where sinners hid behind perfection. I rented a small bungalow on the outskirts of the club, one of those places that smelled of sunscreen and false promises. I told myself it was only to rest, but every dawn found me awake, peering toward the golf course through the old telephoto lens that once belonged to Daniel. He had cherished that camera, and now it felt like his presence guiding me, urging me to keep watching. For 2 days I saw nothing unusual, only wealthy men laughing, women dressed in white, and couples celebrating life beneath the sun. Then, on the third afternoon, as the sky began to dim, I saw him. Emilio. His silhouette was unmistakable, his posture familiar, the precise way he turned his shoulders before swinging the club. My heart slammed so hard against my ribs I had to grab the railing to stay upright. I could not breathe. There he was, alive, untouched by grief, laughing freely as if the past had never existed. My hands shook as I raised the camera to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me, and that was when I saw her. Valeria stood beside him wearing a short ivory dress, her hair loose, her laughter floating through the air like a cruel mockery. She placed her hand on his chest, and Emilio wrapped his arm around her, kissing her cheek with the same tenderness he once gave me. A sob rose in my throat, and I covered my mouth to keep from screaming as tears blurred my vision. I pressed the shutter again and again, each click cutting deeper than the last, capturing proof that the most unthinkable betrayal was not only real, but openly celebrated beneath the same sun that once blessed my marriage. I kept watching through the lens even as my hands trembled violently and my tears distorted the image. I had to see everything. I had to know how far the lie went. Suddenly, two small figures ran toward them across the green field, a little girl with golden curls, and a boy with a smile that mirrored Daniel's so perfectly it stole the air from my lungs. They threw themselves into Emilio's arms, calling him Daddy, their voices ringing with joy. He laughed, lifting them into the air, and kissed Valeria on the forehead as a group of well-dressed men applauded them like the perfect family. In that moment, my body gave up. The camera slipped from my fingers and fell onto the table as I clutched my chest, gasping for a breath that would not come, realizing that the lie I had uncovered was far deeper and far crueler than I had ever imagined. My lips moved on their own, repeating a prayer that felt broken and useless. It cannot be, my God, it cannot be. I lifted my eyes to the sky, and the sun seemed to mock me, shining brightly and indifferently as if nothing sacred had been violated. In that instant, the truth settled inside me with unbearable clarity. I had not simply been betrayed. I had been replaced, erased from the world of the living, exchanged for the very woman who had pretended to comfort me in my grief. Valeria had not only taken control of my business and wrapped herself in my son's memory, she had stepped into my place beside the man I had mourned for years. The tears stopped suddenly, as if my body had decided there was no more room for weakness. I picked up the camera, retrieved the photograph that had fallen to the ground, and placed it carefully back into my bag. My hands were steady now. For the first time in a very long while, my thoughts were clear, calm, sharp like the line where the sea meets the sky. I understood then that I would not waste my strength on revenge or despair. I would search for the truth. Because if Emilio was alive, someone would have to answer, not only to God, but to me. I returned to Guadalajara carrying a heart that felt shattered and a mind that burned without rest. Sleep abandoned me completely. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Emilio standing beside Valeria, heard the children calling him father, and felt the humiliation tighten around my chest. I knew I could not confront this nightmare without evidence, without facts that could not be denied, so I sought out the one person who knew every hidden corner of our finances and every secret buried behind the balance sheets. Don Fabian had been Emilio's accountant for more than 20 years, loyal, discreet, and meticulous. His office looked exactly as I remembered it, with metal filing cabinets lining the walls, the smell of old paper and ink heavy in the air, and curtains yellowed by time. When he saw me enter, he rose slowly from his chair and embraced me with trembling arms. He said he never thought he would see me again, and there was something in his voice that mixed affection with fear. I told him everything, from the golf club bill to what my eyes had witnessed in Cancun. As I spoke, his hands clenched together on the desk, his fingers twisting nervously. When I finished, silence filled the room like a suffocating fog. After a long moment, Don Fabian lowered his gaze, took a deep breath, and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He removed an old folder with Emilio's name written on it and placed it in front of me, his hands trembling. He told me there was something I needed to know, something he had carried like a stone in his chest for years. My husband, he said, had personally collected my life insurance policy a week before the accident. The words struck me so hard I could not react. 12 million pesos, he continued, explaining that he had signed the paperwork himself because Emilio swore it was for a temporary business arrangement and that I should never find out. When the accident was announced, Don Fabian had believed it was all a tragic coincidence. As he spoke, everything began to make horrifying sense. The closed coffin, the heavy smell of incense, Valeria's calm voice telling me the body was unrecognizable. Nausea rose in my throat as the truth assembled itself piece by piece. Emilio had not only survived. He had planned his death, his inheritance, and my humiliation with the precision of a thief. What I once believed was love revealed itself as a perfectly executed deception. I left that office feeling as though the ground beneath my feet no longer existed. The cross above the empty grave flashed through my mind, the tears I had poured over a lie, and the prayers whispered to a man who had never been gone. What I had mourned was not a death, but my own innocence. Days later, I returned to Cancun with a determination I barely recognized as my own. I spent hours reviewing every document Don Fabian had given me, studying each signature, each date, each transaction, until every road led back to the same place. That false paradise where Emilio and Valeria had built their new empire. I dressed simply in a beige suit and dark glasses, carrying a folder like any businesswoman seeking opportunity. When I looked at myself in the hotel mirror, I no longer saw the fragile widow from Guadalajara. I saw a woman prepared to look her executioners in the eyes without blinking. I walked into the Public Registry of Commerce in Cancun, a modern white building filled with the cold hum of air conditioning and the smell of fresh paperwork. I approached the counter and smiled politely, introducing myself as an investor from Guadalajara interested in reviewing the records of a local company. The official behind the desk, a young man with a crooked tie, began typing casually, humming under his breath. I held my composure while sweat gathered beneath my fingers around the folder. After a few seconds, he spoke without lifting his eyes, informing me that the company had been registered 3 years earlier, during the pandemic, and that its co-founders were Valeria Vega and Emilio Rivera. Time stopped. The soft buzz of the fluorescent lights became the only sound I could hear. I asked him to repeat it, my voice cold and distant, and he did so without understanding the weight of what he was saying. My surname, my legacy, my history had been stolen and used as a banner for the very people who destroyed my life. Rage burned behind my eyes as I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms while I swallowed the humiliation threatening to spill out. They had not only taken my love, they had taken my name, my work, and the dignity that defined who I was. In that moment, something inside me shifted forever. Grief hardened into a sharp, controlled flame, fueled by truth, courage, and the certainty that this story was far from over. I no longer wanted to cry or search for explanations. Understanding would not cleanse what they had done. What I wanted was exposure, because no one, not even Emilio, had the right to stain my name and wear it as if it belonged to them. My heart pounded as I stared again at the computer screen, where the cursed names glowed with cruel clarity: Valeria Vega and Emilio Rivera, joined together as if they were the rightful heirs of everything I had built. I knew I could not ask for an official copy without drawing attention, so I pretended to rummage through my bag, slipping my phone out just enough to capture the screen. The soft click of the shutter sounded louder than thunder in my ears. The official looked up immediately, suspicion tightening his face, and asked what I was doing. I forced a weak smile and told him I was only verifying information, though my voice betrayed me with its tremor. Down the hallway, I noticed a security guard moving toward us, speaking into his radio, and instinct told me that staying even a second longer would cost me everything. I shut the folder abruptly and headed for the exit, but a shout followed me, sharp and urgent, accusing me of attempting to leak internal information. I began to run. My heels struck the marble floor as alarms echoed through the building, metallic and unforgiving. I crossed the lobby in a blur, pushed through the revolving door, and burst into the street where the midday sun blinded me. I ran without looking back, weaving through startled tourists and traffic, my breath burning in my lungs, until my legs carried me toward the seafront. There, facing the vast turquoise sea, stood a small white church crowned with a blue cross that glimmered under the sun. The Church of Our Lady of the Sea. I entered without hesitation and closed the door behind me. Silence enveloped me, broken only by the distant rhythm of waves and the toll of a bell. My strength finally gave out, and I collapsed onto the first wooden pew, breathing hard as fear and fury churned together until my vision blurred. A gentle hand rested on my shoulder, and when I looked up, I saw an elderly woman dressed in a white habit, her eyes calm and deep, filled with a compassion I had not felt in years. She called me daughter in a voice both soft and unwavering, telling me that when God allows pain, it is because he wants us to open our eyes. The word daughter shattered something inside me. Tears welled up uncontrollably as I nodded, clutching the rosary at my neck. In that moment, I knew I had not arrived there by chance. God had led me to that place to give me strength and an ally. Sister Maria Elena guided me to a small room behind the altar, a humble space with a narrow bed, a wooden table, and a window overlooking the sea. The air smelled of wax and salt, and amid the murmur of waves and distant prayers, I felt a fragile peace settle over me, as if unseen hands were steadying my shoulders. She brought me hot tea and placed a worn rosary in my hands, asking if I wished to stay the night, assuring me that no one would search for me within the house of the Lord. I nodded, unable to speak. When she left me alone, I emptied my bag and spread the documents across the table: photographs, copies, signatures, and the life insurance policy that proved the lie I had lived. I turned on the old lamp and knew I could not carry this burden alone. In a corner of the parish office, Sister Maria Elena showed me a dusty fax machine, nearly forgotten by time, explaining that it still worked if one had patience. I gave her the number of Don Joaquin, the lawyer who had worked with Emilio and who, unlike others, had never betrayed me. The machine hummed and groaned as it slowly transmitted each page. With every sheet sent, I felt as though I was reclaiming a piece of my life, pulling truth out of the shadows where it had been buried. When the machine finally fell silent, I stood by the window and watched the sea crash violently against the rocks, as if it shared my rage. I closed my eyes and let the breeze touch my face as I whispered that Valeria had taken everything from me except my life, and as long as God allowed me to breathe, He would also allow me to fight. For the first time, I did not see myself as a victim. I was a woman who had lost her husband, her son, and her name, but not her will. I understood then that divine justice does not always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it comes like the tide, advancing slowly but with unstoppable force. And I, Rosario Vega, had already begun to move. When I returned to Guadalajara, my heart was steady, certain that I carried the evidence needed to reclaim my dignity. Yet the moment I stepped into my house, I sensed that something was wrong. The curtains were drawn, the air heavy with expensive perfume and fresh betrayal. In the living room, Valeria waited for me, impeccably dressed, her posture confident, no longer bothering to hide her sense of superiority. She greeted me with feigned courtesy, remarking on my early return from what she assumed was a spiritual retreat. Her voice dripped with false sweetness. On the table behind her lay official documents stamped with court seals, envelopes from family court, arranged with deliberate care. I asked what it was all about, though my heart already knew. She smiled, that familiar smile that never reached her eyes, and dismissed it as a simple formality, a preventative measure for my own well-being. She explained calmly that she had noticed changes in me: moments of confusion, forgetfulness, unusual behavior, all spoken with the practiced tone of concern. She presented a medical report claiming memory loss and dependence on tranquilizers, and the blood drained from my face as she spoke of court evaluations and temporary guardianship, assuring me it was for my protection. A bitter laugh escaped me, echoing through the room, sharp and broken. I asked her if she was calling me crazy, and she tilted her head with counterfeit compassion, telling me not to take it that way, reminding me that pain, she said, can distort reality. I walked toward her slowly, meeting her gaze without blinking. I told her she was the one distorting reality, that I had proof, real proof, but she repeated the word with a cold smile, as if tasting it. She said no one would ever believe the fantasies of an elderly, sick, medicated woman, that soon everything would fade into a bad memory for me. In that moment, I understood the truth with brutal clarity. The battle had only just begun. I had returned determined to clear my name, and she had already built the perfect trap, one where my truth would be labeled delusion and my sanity would be turned into madness. What she did not understand was that I no longer feared losing everything, because I already had. And when a woman who has nothing left begins to move, even the most elaborate lie becomes fragile. From that day on, my house stopped feeling like a home and became an elegant prison. Every corridor smelled of control and surveillance. The employees who once greeted me warmly now avoided my eyes or pretended to be busy whenever I entered a room. I could feel the doubt Valeria had planted, spreading quietly like a disease. One afternoon, as I attempted to make a transfer to pay a jewelry supplier, the computer flashed a message in red stating that the account had been blocked by court order. My stomach tightened painfully. I tried another account, then my personal one, and the same message appeared. Panic climbed into my throat as I called the bank, only to hear a voice of mechanical politeness informing me that all my accounts had been temporarily suspended and that any further inquiries should be directed to my legal representative, Mrs. Valeria Vega. My hand trembled so violently, I nearly dropped the phone. I stared through the window at the garden where Daniel once played as a child and felt an emptiness so vast it stole my breath. Footsteps echoed behind me, and I turned to see Julia, the youngest employee, pretending to dust while watching me closely. She asked if something was wrong without lifting her eyes, her voice tight with tension. I replied calmly that everything was fine, noticing how tightly she clutched the cloth in her hand, waiting for something she could repeat to Valeria. I smiled and told her to inform her boss that I was doing perfectly well, that confinement suited a crazy woman just fine. She shuddered and left without responding. I wandered through the house with a serenity I did not yet feel, testing doors and drawers, only to find them locked. Even the cabinet where I kept my antique jewelry was no longer accessible. Piece by piece, everything I had built was now under her control. She did not need to shout or throw me out. She was erasing me quietly, stripping me of money, authority, and voice until nothing recognizable remained. That night, I sat before Daniel's portrait and whispered that they had taken my accounts but not my plan, that as long as God allowed me to breathe, they had not won. The family gathering that followed was staged like a flawless performance. Valeria had invited business partners, long standing employees, and even a few of Emilio's friends, all assembled in the main room with glasses of wine and smiles rehearsed to perfection. I remained seated at the back, silent, watching her glide among them dressed in white, radiant, claiming ownership over everything that had once belonged to me. Every word she spoke was calculated, every gesture carefully rehearsed. She spoke of expansion, of future projects, of turning Casa Vega into an international name, while no one suspected the rot beneath her polished facade. When she finished speaking, she raised her glass and looked straight at me, thanking me in a voice soaked in false sweetness for all the support I had given her during difficult years. A few people laughed, uncertain why. I stood slowly and replied calmly that supporting her had been my greatest mistake. She stepped closer, defiance flashing in her eyes, and spoke just loudly enough for everyone to hear, saying that Emilio had never truly loved me, that he stayed out of pity and habit, that I had been the convenient wife but never the woman he desired. The room froze. Some guests lowered their eyes, others pretended not to hear, while Valeria savored the silence like a snake savoring its venom. I looked at her without blinking and said that it was curious how someone who lived off the remains of another dared to speak of desire, that Emilio may have taught her how to lie, but he clearly forgot to teach her how to have a soul. Her smile faltered for a brief second, just long enough for the crack in her mask to show. I raised my glass and made a quiet toast to the dead who do not know they are already dead, even though they still breathe. No one spoke. Only the clink of cutlery echoed in the suffocating air. In that moment, I understood that Valeria could take everything from me except my dignity, and that dignity would be the weapon that destroyed her. I remained standing, glass in hand, watching the wine reflect the golden lights above while something inside me shifted forever. I was no longer the trembling widow or the woman seeking sympathy. My eyes moved calmly across the room, taking in the partners who had turned their backs on me, the employees who pretended I no longer existed, and the friends who stayed silent. The role I had played for years was finished. I lowered my glass and smiled, a restrained smile that no one could read. It was the calm of a predator who had finally chosen her moment. My fingers traced the rim of the glass as my mind mapped each step that would follow. I would no longer run or beg. If Valeria had tried to use my madness as her shield, I would use her arrogance as my blade. Silence became my refuge, and patience became my strength. I let her believe she had won, that she had crushed what little strength remained in me, because I understood something she never would. Only those who believe themselves invincible stop guarding their shadows. When our eyes met across that room, I saw her confidence flicker for a brief moment, like a candle disturbed by an unseen breath. I said nothing. There was no need. My eyes carried the weight of humiliation, betrayal, and theft, but also the calm of a woman who had learned to stare wolves in the face without fear. In that silence, I made myself a promise that everything they had stolen from me would return, not through chaos or blind vengeance, but through justice that was slow, exact, and inevitable. As Valeria raised her glass again, convinced of her victory, I stopped seeing her as my enemy. I saw her for what she truly was, prey. Days later, fate placed another piece of the puzzle before me. I was seated in Don Joaquin's office, surrounded by yellowed files and folders marked with old stamps, reviewing the documents I had sent him from Cancun. My hands moved almost mechanically until I came across a copy of the forensic report from the accident in which my son Daniel had supposedly lost his life. I held it carefully, as though it were something sacred, and began reading line by line. Then my breath caught the date. The report was dated 2 days before the accident had even been reported to the police. My heart began to pound violently as I read it again, slower this time, forcing myself to remain calm. The time of death did not match either. According to the document, Daniel had died at 7 in the evening, but I remembered perfectly that he had called me at 9 that night from his car, telling me he was on his way home and that he would bring my favorite cake. I could still hear his tired but cheerful voice, still see his name glowing on my phone screen, followed by a silence that swallowed my world whole. Don Joaquin noticed the change in my face and leaned closer. When I showed him the report, my fingers trembling, he adjusted his glasses and frowned deeply. He told me the document had been tampered with, that the stamps were wrong, and the signatures did not belong to the original medical examiner. The report was false. A cold wave ran through my body as memories rushed back. The closed coffin, the heavy incense, Valeria's dramatic tears, my blind trust. In that moment, the truth finally revealed itself in its most brutal form. Daniel did not die by accident, he was erased. Maybe not by a weapon in hand, but by greed, by calculation, by a plan designed to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their inheritance. I pressed the paper to my chest, my tears mixing with a rage so deep it burned. They used him, I whispered. They used my son to protect their lie. Don Joaquin nodded silently, knowing there was no turning back from what we had uncovered. From that moment on, truth became my only religion. My son would not rest until justice carried his name as well. It was Maria Elena who moved the next piece into place when I believed I had reached the limit of what I could endure. We had spent the morning reviewing the falsified documents, and while my anger threatened to overflow, she spoke with the calm clarity that defined her. She said that if the forensic report was false, someone had signed the truth first, and where there was a body, there had to be a doctor. That same afternoon, she went into the city center, to a small hospital where she said she still had contacts from her years as a missionary nurse. She returned at dusk, carrying an envelope and a look that held both sorrow and certainty. She told me she had found the doctor who signed Daniel's first death certificate. He was retired now, living in Merida, but he kept copies of all his reports. My voice barely worked when I asked what he had said. Maria Elena crossed herself before answering. She told me that the day after the accident, the doctor never saw Daniel's body. He had been ordered to sign a routine report with pre-filled information, and the cremation request had already been submitted. The person who filed it was a young woman, Valeria. The room seemed to lose all its air. Maria Elena continued, saying the doctor remembered her clearly. A beautiful widow dressed in black, composed, cold-eyed, insisting the cremation take place that very night. She told him I was too distraught to see my son. I closed my eyes as that lie, repeated so many times, finally revealed its true meaning. It was never compassion. It was convenience. She erased all physical evidence before I ever had the chance to doubt. I took the envelope from Maria Elena's hands. Inside was a copy of the cremation request. Valeria's signature stared back at me in blue ink, firm, elegant, merciless. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury barely contained. She took his life and then took his face, I whispered. She erased him from the world to cleanse her sin. Maria Elena held my hands and told me not to be afraid, that shadows always believe they can hide truth, but truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it is buried. When I looked at her, I understood that justice was no longer a distant hope. It was a fire already burning inside me, and this time nothing would put it out. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the convent window, watching the moonlight ripple across the sea. Spread before me on the table were all the pieces of the truth they thought would never be assembled. the insurance policy Emilio collected, the registration of Riviera Joyas, the falsified forensic report, the cremation order signed by Valeria. Each document was a wound, each signature a confession. And as dawn approached, I knew with unshakable certainty that the end of their story had already begun. The more I observed everything they had done, the clearer the pattern became, and it chilled me to my core. This was never a simple betrayal born of weakness or desire. It was a carefully designed execution, planned with patience and precision. I remembered Daniel's laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the future, about modernizing the family jewelry business and protecting what generations before him had built. He had started questioning Valeria's financial decisions months before his death, asking me once if I had noticed strange transfers leaving the accounts. I remembered overhearing heated arguments between them late at night, his voice firm, hers sharp and defensive. At the time, I dismissed it as ordinary marital conflict, never imagining that those conversations were the beginning of his death sentence. Now everything aligned with terrifying clarity. With Daniel alive, Valeria and Emilio could never fully control Casa Vega. His name stood in their way, legally and morally. His death was not tragedy, it was strategy. I opened the insurance file Don Fabian had given me and studied it carefully. Daniel's policy, 6 million pesos, had been collected by his wife barely a week after the accident. But it was the toxicology report attached to the file that froze the blood in my veins. Among the altered values was an abnormally high level of barbiturates, far beyond anything compatible with a healthy man. I closed my eyes and saw my son behind the wheel, smiling tiredly, trusting the woman sitting beside him. Valeria, I imagined the heaviness creeping into his body, his reflexes slowing, his mind clouding as the road curved ahead. No witnesses, no questions. A car leaving the road on an empty stretch of asphalt. A perfect tragedy crafted to look like fate. It was not an accident, I whispered, my voice trembling. They drugged him or poisoned him and then dressed his death as misfortune. Emilio disappeared to secure the money, and Valeria eliminated the last obstacle between them and absolute control. Maria Elena entered the room quietly, carrying a candle whose flame flickered softly. She found me standing motionless, staring at the wall as if the truth had been carved into it. She asked what was wrong, calling me daughter with that same gentleness that never wavered. I looked at her with a calm that surprised even me, the kind of calm that only arrives when pain finally transforms into purpose. I told her I knew what they had done and that I knew how to prove it. Daniel did not die in an accident. He was killed for inheritance. She looked at me with a mixture of tenderness and pride, as if witnessing a rebirth. Then she said it was time to let silence speak. I nodded slowly as the wind stirred the curtains and the sea roared in the distance. For the first time since my son's death, I felt that he was not lost, but waiting, trusting his mother to do what she had always done best, protect what she loved, even if it meant walking straight through hell. From that dawn forward, I stopped praying from resignation and began praying from strength. The truth lay before me, raw and undeniable, and now it had to be turned into justice. I knew I could not do it alone, but I was no longer alone. By my side stood the few who had never betrayed me. Don Joaquin, my lawyer, whose loyalty had survived decades of silence, and Carmen, the head of the workshops, who had worked beside me since the days when Emilio barely dared to dream of owning a jewelry store. We met in secret inside Carmen's small workshop, where the smell of molten metal mixed with hope and the steady rhythm of a hammer striking gold echoed like a heartbeat. She locked the door and drew the curtains before speaking, telling me that whatever needed to be done, she would do it because she owed Valeria nothing. She spoke of stolen work, stolen years, stolen dignity, and her loyalty moved me more than words could express. I laid the folder of documents and photographs on the table and explained that Valeria and Emilio had hidden their crimes inside digital files, contracts registered under third-party names, and falsified surveys. I needed to retrieve everything to prove that Daniel's death was not an accident and that Riviera Joyas had been built with stolen money and stolen designs. Don Joaquin nodded, his eyes burning with a determination I had not seen in him for years. He said he still had contacts in the commercial registry and the banks, but we would need to move quickly and quietly. If Valeria sensed even a shadow of suspicion, she would destroy everything. Carmen then opened a metal box and removed a small hard drive. She explained that it contained copies of the original Casa Vega designs, the ones Daniel and I had signed long before Valeria altered them. If those designs appeared in Riviera Joyas, the theft would be undeniable. That night, inside the silent workshop, we connected the hard drive to an old computer. One folder opened after another, revealing names, dates, altered contracts, and a network of lies so dense it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Through that stolen data, the path to truth finally emerged. As the keyboard clattered softly, a prayer repeated itself in my mind over and over. My God, if you grant me one more day of life, let it be to clear my son's name. And for the first time, I felt he was listening. The days that followed passed in disciplined silence. My pain became molten metal, something I had to melt down with my own hands to transform into purpose. In Carmen's workshop, surrounded by fire, silver, and redemption, fragments of my past took form again. I decided to prepare an exhibition. The collection would be called Vega Legacy, but it was not meant to impress. It was a trap. Each piece carried my hidden signature, a tiny engraving placed inside the metal, a tradition Emilio never cared to learn but one I had never abandoned. That mark was my identity, the DNA of my work. If Valeria had used my designs to build her empire, these jewels would expose her. Carmen helped me polish the necklaces, while Don Joaquin discreetly contacted the organizers of the Guadalajara International Jewelry Exhibition, where Valeria planned to present Riviera Joya's newest collection. The stage could not have been more perfect. As I set stones into rings, each strike of the hammer echoed like a vow. This does not end here. One by one, the pieces began to glow on the table, carrying stories of love, grief, rage, and survival. Tears were trapped inside gold. Promises shimmered in silver. Fury transformed itself into beauty. When the final piece was finished, I held it in my hands, trembling. It was an amethyst pendant, like the one Emilio once gave me on our wedding day, but this one carried an engraving hidden from view, a single word meant for the moment of truth: justice. I placed it inside a velvet lined box and whispered that each stone would be a witness and each signature a voice. Valeria stole my name, my son, and my heart, but she could not steal the truth. I whispered to myself that when those lights finally came on, the world would know who lied and who survived. For the first time in many years, I saw my reflection in the polished gold before me and recognized the woman I had once been: Rosario Vega, jeweler, mother, survivor. I understood then that the next time someone spoke my name, it would be with respect or with fear, but never again with pity. The day of the exhibition arrived under a strange and heavy sky, as if the air itself sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Guadalajara shimmered with banners and flashing cameras as journalists hurried across the plaza. Inside the convention center, the atmosphere was thick with expensive perfume, ambition, and whispered expectation. Designers, investors, reporters, and curious spectators filled the hall, forming a restless sea of murmurs. Valeria entered like royalty. She wore a white silk dress that flowed effortlessly around her, and a diamond necklace I recognized instantly. One of my own designs, copied stroke for stroke from the piece I had created for Casa Vega's 20th anniversary. Her smile was flawless, her posture that of someone who believed she had earned every stolen jewel she wore. I stayed at the back of the room, wrapped in a dark scarf, invisible among the shadows, my eyes fixed on the stage. When the spotlights flared to life, the presenter's voice thundered through the speakers, announcing Valeria Vega as the visionary behind a new era of Mexican jewelry. Applause erupted as she stepped forward, basking in the admiration. She thanked the audience in that calculated, honeyed tone and spoke of passion, strength, and family legacy, repeating the words as if she owned them. Each sentence burned inside me. As the models began to walk the runway, displaying necklaces, rings, and earrings, my breath tightened. Every curve, every engraving, every hidden initial belonged to me. This was not inspiration, it was theft. My art, my years, my soul had been turned into spectacle. I pressed a hand against my chest, feeling the rosary beneath the fabric. Carmen leaned toward me and whispered if those were truly my designs, even pointing out the amethyst pendant that mirrored the one I had just finished. I answered calmly that they were, and that tonight would be the last time Valeria would see them shine. Applause roared as cameras flashed, but no one noticed that I had begun to move. Step by step, I advanced through the crowd toward the place where everything had begun and where it would end. Each fake jewel glittered under the lights, unaware that it was about to betray its thief. My mark was still alive, and it was ready to bite. When I reached the front, the reflections of the lights danced across the marble floor. Valeria continued speaking confidently, surrounded by cameras, flattery, and stolen glory. I removed the scarf from my head, straightened my shoulders, and walked forward with deliberate calm. Some people recognized me and parted instinctively. Others froze, sensing the shift in the room. Valeria saw me only when it was too late. Her smile faltered, and she lowered the microphone, asking in a strained whisper what I was doing there. I climbed onto the stage without waiting for permission. The murmurs swelled as I lifted one of the displayed pieces, a white gold bracelet with spiral filigree, and held it high for everyone to see. I told them clearly that the design bore my name and my story, that it was created by these hands long before she ever dreamed of stealing it. Silence fell like a blade. Valeria attempted a nervous smile and accused me of confusion, of a conscience distorted by grief. But I stepped closer and turned the bracelet so the inner engraving caught the light. I pointed to my signature, R. Vega, engraved with precision and intention. I told them every piece on that stage carried the same mark, proof that she had stolen not only my work but my life. The murmurs erupted into gasps as cameras clicked frantically. Organizers moved forward but hesitated, unwilling to touch me. Valeria's face drained of color as she stumbled back, calling it slander and claiming there was no proof. I answered with steady certainty that I had everything: the contracts, the transfers, the falsified reports, the insurance policies, and above all the truth she could no longer bury. I moved closer until I could see the fear unraveling behind her eyes. I told her that she carried guilt in the hands that signed my son's cremation papers, in the smile with which she erased his name, and in the money she shared with a man who pretended to be dead. A wave of horror rippled through the hall. Valeria stepped backward, lost her balance, and the glass she held shattered on the floor with a sharp crack, like a seal finally breaking. I did not flinch. I drew a breath and told the audience that I had not come for spectacle or pity, but for justice, because the dead cannot speak, but mothers do. The hall fell into absolute silence, and for the first time in years, the weight crushing my chest lifted. I was no longer the victim. I was the voice the lie feared. As the tension hung thick in the air, I raised my hand slightly toward Carmen, who stood near the sound booth. She met my gaze and nodded once. The stage lights dimmed abruptly. The giant screens behind Valeria flickered, the Riviera Joya's logo dissolving into darkness. Then the first image appeared, glowing unmistakably before the eyes of everyone present. The first image filled the screen, and the entire room seemed to inhale at once. Emilio was alive, laughing freely at the Cancun Golf Club, raising his glass as Valeria kissed him on the cheek with practiced affection. Camera flashes exploded instantly. Some people screamed. Others covered their mouths, unable to process what they were seeing. The images continued without mercy. Documents appeared one after another. The business registration bearing both their names, the life insurance transfers, checks signed by Emilio months after his supposed death. Over the images, my recorded voice echoed calmly through the hall, steady and unbroken. For 5 years, I mourned a man who was never dead. For 5 years, I believed my son died in an accident until I discovered he was murdered for money. Everything you see here is the truth that was stolen from me. Then came the cremation request, Valeria's signature unmistakable in blue ink, followed by the falsified coroner's report. A collective sound rose from the crowd, not quite a cry, not quite silence, but something sacred and horrified all at once. Valeria turned ghostly pale and rushed toward the technical booth, screaming for the screens to be turned off, but Don Joaquin was already there. Holding a folder high above the chaos, and shouting that the originals were in the hands of the prosecutor's office, that this was a formal public denunciation of fraud, identity theft, and homicide. The press reacted like a storm breaking loose. Microphones surged forward. Cameras flashed like lightning. Voices shouted questions from every direction, demanding answers that could no longer be hidden. Security tried to push the reporters back, but the truth had already detonated. Two plainclothes officers stepped onto the stage and announced that Valeria Vega was under arrest for fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. Emilio, who had been trying to blend into the crowd, was recognized within seconds and swallowed by cameras and voices. The hall dissolved into sirens, shouts, and disbelief. I remained still at the center of the stage, the amethyst pendant warm between my fingers. I looked up at the artificial lights above me and whispered Daniel's name, telling him it was done, that the truth had finally come into the open. As the officers led Valeria away, she searched for me with her eyes. There was no pride left in her gaze, only fear. In that fear, I felt a peace I had not known in years. Outside, sirens wailed as the crowd struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Valeria was escorted past the cameras, her head lowered, her wrists cuffed, the stolen jewelry still glittering on her hands. Journalists shouted questions she could not answer. She whispered excuses, blaming Emilio, claiming coercion, but no one was listening anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, and with the falsified forensic report and cremation request now exposed, the investigation shifted irrevocably toward premeditated murder. Emilio, detained nearby, tried to approach her, ordering her to stay silent, but she turned on him with a hatred so raw it stripped him of authority. She screamed that he had promised no one would ever know. From a distance, I answered calmly that he had also promised love. Her eyes met mine one last time, burning with rage and desperation. She swore it was not over. I replied with quiet certainty that she was right, that it was not over, because it ends where justice begins. The patrol car door slammed shut, and its reflection disappeared into the blue lights. Applause rose from the crowd, not celebratory, but heavy with relief. I breathed deeply, watching the night settle over Guadalajara. Valeria was under arrest. Emilio would face the truth. And the lie that had stolen my life finally had a name. Then, suddenly, a shout cut through the noise. Emilio was running. He had used the chaos to break free, shoving his way through photographers and fleeing down the corridors of the convention center. Outside, sirens pierced the night as he stumbled into the parking lot, past the banner announcing the exhibition that had destroyed him, Vega Legacy. His body failed him before the law could. Witnesses saw him clutch his chest, stagger, and collapse onto the rain-slick pavement. By the time officers reached him, it was over. Emilio Vega Rivera, the man who faked his death, betrayed his family, and believed himself untouchable, lay still beneath the flashing lights. Greed had taken its final payment. When they told me, I felt no triumph, no joy. Only a quiet, inescapable calm. I went to where his body lay, covered by an emergency blanket, the face I had once loved now pale and empty. I knelt beside him slowly. There were no words left to say, only acceptance. His story had ended the way it was written, not by my hand, but by the weight of his own lies. I stood, straightened my shoulders, and walked away. My son's name had been cleared, my work reclaimed, my truth restored. I was no longer the widow who prayed in silence or the woman erased by betrayal. I was Rosario Vega, jeweler, mother, survivor. And the world would remember my name, not because I cried, but because I stood when the truth demanded a voice. The man who once swore eternal love to me had died twice. The first time was the day he betrayed his soul, and the second was there on the ground he would never walk again. The officers stepped back in respectful silence as I leaned toward him, touched his cold forehead with my fingertips, closed my eyes, and spoke without anger, without triumph, only with a truth that weighed like lead. God does not sleep. Emilio only waited for me to open my eyes. The wind carried my words away as if they no longer belonged to me. In that moment, I understood that the greatest punishment is not death, but awareness that arrives too late. Emilio believed he had deceived the world, but divine justice has an implacable memory. I stood up with dignity and walked away without looking back, through the wail of sirens and the murmured voices, each step carrying me farther from a grave and closer to the life that was finally mine. Weeks passed after that day, when justice spoke aloud, and newspapers filled their front pages with a truth that once seemed impossible. Businessman Emilio Vega faked his death to commit multi-million peso fraud. His accomplice and daughter-in-law Valeria Vega arrested for homicide and fraud. The courts ordered the restitution of every asset: the house in Colonia Americana, Casa Vega, the frozen accounts, even the old cabin that had once been my refuge. Everything returned to my name, as if the universe itself were correcting a cruel mistake. Yet inside me there was no celebration, no laughter, no victory. Only a profound stillness, the calm that follows a devastating storm. Lawyers, employees, notaries, and journalists all sought my attention, but all I wanted was silence. One morning, when the keys were officially back in my hands, I wrapped my gray shawl around my shoulders and walked alone to the Church of Our Lady of the Sea. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with gentle colors. The same place where I once fled in fear now received me with a peace I had not known in years. I knelt before the image of the Virgin and allowed calm tears to fall without shame. I thanked her not for returning what I lost, but for not letting me lose myself. I remembered all the nights I believed God had forgotten me, and finally understood He had only been waiting for me to learn how to see. I was no longer the deceived widow or the broken mother. I was a woman awake. For the first time, I prayed without asking for anything, only giving thanks. Outside, the sea breeze carried the murmur of waves, and I knew that although I had my jewels, my house, and my name again, the true treasure lived somewhere simpler. Faith, the one thing that held me together when everything else collapsed. As the sun touched my face, I whispered that gold may lose its shine, but faith never rusts. The news reached me on a gray morning. Valeria wanted to see me. She had spent months in pretrial detention awaiting sentencing. They said she prayed daily in the chapel and wrote letters she never sent. I hesitated, then agreed. Not out of pity, but because some words must be spoken face to face. The prison smelled of iron and disinfectant, of lives suspended between regret and consequence. In a cold room with walls that absorbed whispers, she stood before me thinner, diminished, her eyes hollow. She thanked me for coming and asked for forgiveness. She spoke of her children, of blood ties, of not wanting them to grow up hating their grandmother. Silence filled the room like stone. Blood is not a choice, but actions are. I told her that forgiveness is not forgetting, and that it begins with restitution and accountability. Hope, I said, does not come from my mercy, but from her repentance. It begins when excuses end. I told her children would one day know who she was, and who I was, and that I hoped it would teach them not to repeat her mistakes. When I left, journalists waited outside asking if I had forgiven her. I did not answer. Some truths do not belong to sound bites. The dawn over Guadalajara carried a softer light that day. The years of darkness were gone, and with them, the woman who lived imprisoned by silence. I walked forward without haste, without fear, carrying neither hatred nor guilt. My son's name had been restored, my life reclaimed, and though scars remain, they no longer define me. I am Rosario Vega. I survived not by destroying others, but by standing when truth demanded a voice. And that, more than justice or revenge, is the legacy that will endure. From that moment on, each day began with purpose. With the compensation recovered and the company finally cleansed of every trace of corruption, I understood exactly what I had to do with the pain that had shaped me. I needed to give it meaning. That is how the Daniel Vega Fund was born. A scholarship created for the children of humble jewelers and artisans who dreamed of studying, but had never been given the chance. I wanted my son's name, the name that had been stained by the greed of others, to become a symbol of hope. At the opening ceremony, surrounded by young hands trembling with curiosity and ambition, I spoke softly and without spectacle, telling them that gold is shaped by fire just as the soul is, and that the fire they carried within them should not destroy them but transform them. Watching their smiles returned something to me that I believed had been lost forever: faith in the future. But my work did not end there. I bought the old house in Colonia Americana, the same house that had witnessed so many tears, lies, and silences. I did not sell it, nor did I return to live there as before. I transformed it into a workshop and a school for older women, many of them widows, abandoned, invisible, carrying stories no one had ever asked to hear. I called it the House of New Sparkle. There, every worktable became a place of rebirth, filled with laughter, prayer, and steady hands shaping jewelry that carried more truth than gold ever could. The walls that once absorbed betrayal now echoed with hope. Carmen led the courses with patience and strength. Maria Elena guided conversations about faith and dignity. Often I stood quietly in the doorway, watching women like myself learn how to turn pain into beauty, and I knew this was the justice I had been seeking all along. One afternoon, as the sunlight gilded the windows, Don Joaquin arrived with a tired smile and a package wrapped in brown paper. He placed it in my hands and told me it had just come from the press. The brilliance of silence, the cover read silver letters framing a small amethyst at the center. It was our story. Written together, not as an act of revenge, but as testimony. I understood then that silence had never been weakness. It had been the space where I learned to listen, to God, to my son, and to myself. Sitting by the workshop window, watching the women work as the light danced across freshly polished metal, I realized I had achieved something I never imagined. I no longer needed justice, because justice had arrived disguised as peace. Time passed, slowly and wisely, healing what could be healed and leaving scars where lessons had been learned. One spring morning, many years later, I returned to Cancun. I carried no luggage, only a small bag and the amethyst pendant that had become my compass. I walked along the coast where I had once discovered the betrayal that changed my life. The sea was the same, vast and brilliant, but I was not. I stood before the golf club, now quiet and unrecognizable, and closed my eyes as the salty air filled my lungs. Each wave seemed to erase another fragment of the past. Then I heard a small voice behind me call my name. Grandma Rosario. I turned slowly. A little girl stood there, holding a seashell in her hands, her dark eyes so deep they stole my breath. I recognized Daniel in her gaze, a trace of him preserved by a fate that had taken so much but not everything. She told me her mother was sorry, that she prayed for me every day. I knelt to her height and asked if she knew who I was. She smiled innocently and said I was the grandmother who made jewelry that shone like the sky. I looked at the sea glowing like a promise and accepted the shell she offered me. I told her to tell her mother that the sea had already carried away all the pain, and that sometimes God forgives us before we even know how. She hugged me without a word, and in that embrace I felt something no verdict, no restitution, no passage of time had ever given me: absolute peace. When she ran back toward the shore, leaving her small footprints beside mine, I remained there watching the horizon ignite in gold and red. I took the rosary from my bag, the same one that had accompanied me through every battle, and held it up as the last light touched the beads. In that instant, I understood that faith and justice were never separate paths, but rivers that meet at the end of the journey. A tear fell, not from pain, but from gratitude. I began to walk barefoot along the beach, the rosary between my fingers, toward a horizon that burned like liquid gold. Each step was a farewell and a promise. The wind played with my hair, the sea breathed slowly, eternal and patient, and my voice disappeared among the waves as I whispered what I finally knew to be true. God's justice shines brighter than any jewel, and his forgiveness brighter than any gold. And so Rosario Vega, widow, mother, jeweler, woman, continued walking toward the light, where pain and faith finally merged into a single truth called peace. Her story did not end with revenge, nor with applause, but with a quiet strength that only those who survive betrayal can understand. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell me what city you are watching from and what you felt. Would you have forgiven like Rosario, or would you have let justice follow its own path? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next stories of justice, resilience, and second chances. And remember, God does not sleep. He is only waiting for us to open our eyes.